The summer of 1901 remains one of the deadliest and most extreme weather events in U.S. history. While it's often overshadowed by other historical disasters, it's an event that had a lasting impact on the people in the country. This heat wave, which gripped the eastern United States, was unlike anything people had experienced before. For nearly 2 months, the country sweltered under intense heat that pushed temperatures to extreme highs. This heat wave wasn't just about how hot it got on a single day, it was about the relentless and unrelenting heat that lasted from the second half of June through all of July. In fact, some areas went for weeks without any break in the heat. In cities like Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware, temperatures soared above 90 degrees Fahrenheit day after day. The heat climbed even higher at times, with some days reaching a stifling 109 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was so intense that it was said to be unbearable, especially in urban areas with little to no relief. What made this heat wave particularly dangerous was its timing. It came after a series of wet months that had left the East Coast with a false sense of relief. Despite nor'easters and heavy rainfall earlier in the year, a drought had already begun to develop. By the time the heat wave hit, it was accompanied by a severe lack of water, particularly in the Ohio Valley and upper Midwest. In Illinois, it was recorded as the driest year ever, and Missouri, which saw only 0.21 inches of rain, also experienced record-breaking dryness. But the heat wasn't just felt in the Midwest, it spread like wildfire across the country. One of the most noticeable and devastating effects of this heat wave was the impact it had on daily life. People had to adjust their routines, and public health was severely compromised. Hospitals became overwhelmed with patients suffering from heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses. The lack of water and sanitation made things even worse. The temperature soared to such extremes that urban slums became uninhabitable. In tenement buildings, the temperature inside was reported to be as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and suffocating. And with no air conditioning, people had to find other ways to survive. Even basic transportation was severely affected. In New York City, streetcars, which relied on horses, had to stop running because the animals couldn't endure the heat. In fact, the heat was so intense that it caused a massive loss of life among horses, with 250 horses dying in one day alone in New York City. Factories across the country closed their doors as workers could no longer bear to work in the oppressive heat. The few factories that remained open allowed their workers to wear light clothing, a radical departure from the usual heavy three-piece suits of the time. As the heat wave dragged on, its toll grew heavier, and the situation became more desperate. The heat was not just a discomfort, it was a killer. By the end of the summer, it was estimated that at least 9,500 people had lost their lives. This was a staggering number for a time when the population was far smaller, and this heat wave was the deadliest of its kind in U.S. history at the time. The death toll was so high because of the heat's prolonged nature, which left no room for recovery. The elderly, the young, and those who lived in poor, crowded conditions were especially vulnerable. People across the country began to panic as the heat showed no signs of letting up. There was no cool breeze to offer relief, and the heat's duration made it even more unbearable. It wasn't just the heat that was causing suffering. The mental strain of such prolonged extreme conditions was also beginning to take its toll. As the heat continued for weeks on end, people were pushed to their limits. Many experienced emotional breakdowns, with some even committing suicide as a result of the unbearable conditions. In one of the most dramatic impacts, entire cities came to a standstill. The government was forced to respond to the crisis, but with limited resources and no real precedent for dealing with something so catastrophic, the response was slow. People were left to cope with the heat on their own, and the poor were hit the hardest. While the wealthy could afford to flee to cooler climates, the less fortunate had no escape. This stark divide between the haves and have-nots was thrown into sharp focus, as the most vulnerable people were left to suffer the worst of the heat wave's wrath. The summer of 1901 serves as a haunting reminder of the power of extreme weather. Even though it wasn't as widely discussed in the years that followed, it changed the lives of thousands of people and left its mark on the country. It brought attention to the vulnerability of a nation that had never experienced such an event, and it opened the door for more awareness about how extreme weather could disrupt lives. As we dive deeper into the summer of 1901, we'll explore how it shaped the nation's response to future natural disasters and left lessons that are still relevant today. As the heat wave continued through the second half of June and into July, the United States was experiencing the full extent of its devastation. While the first few weeks of the heat wave had already begun to disrupt daily life, the situation worsened as temperatures kept climbing. The relentless heat spread further across the country, hitting new areas harder than ever before. By the end of June, cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were enduring extreme temperatures, with some days reaching highs that many had never imagined possible. In New York City, temperatures soared to 105 degrees Fahrenheit and remained uncomfortably high for days. By the end of the month, the heat had already wreaked havoc on public health, with hospitals overcrowded with people suffering from heat stroke, dehydration, and other related illnesses. With no escape from the heat, people began to suffer mentally as well as physically. In Philadelphia, where the heat lingered at over 90 degrees Fahrenheit for more than a week, it wasn't just the unbearable temperature that caused distress. The humidity was nearly as oppressive, making it even harder for people to breathe. By early July, the heat wave reached a new intensity. In Wilmington, Delaware, the mercury climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple days, pushing residents to their breaking point. In many places, the average temperature was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit each day, and the heat persisted without any cool intervals. The prolonged nature of the heat wave caused tremendous suffering for the people in its path. Farmers in the Midwest and South watched their crops wither, unable to withstand the dry, scorching conditions. The drought, which had already taken root in the region, was aggravated by the heat, making the already dire situation even worse. Even the most resilient of the population found it difficult to keep going. Workers in factories and offices were forced to endure long hours in uncomfortably hot conditions. The extreme heat made physical labor nearly impossible. In Chicago, some factories had to shut down entirely, and others were left scrambling to find ways to keep their workers safe. Many of the workers were forced to wear lighter clothing, such as gymnastic costumes, a rare sight in the days when formal attire was expected in the workplace. This lack of comfort only added to the overwhelming sense of helplessness that people began to feel as the heat wave stretched on. As the heat wave worsened, the most vulnerable members of society became even more at risk. The elderly, children, and those with existing health problems were especially affected by the sweltering temperatures. In the crowded, poorly ventilated tenement buildings of cities like New York and Philadelphia, it wasn't just the heat that took its toll. The lack of proper sanitation and clean water caused a surge in heat-related deaths. People were unable to get relief, whether it was through cooling down or finding the basics for survival. Many people couldn't afford to leave the cities, while others who tried to escape to cooler areas found that they had no place to go. In urban slums, the conditions were unbearable. Without access to the air conditioning or fans, the heat trapped people inside, and the air felt thick and suffocating. Many residents attempted to cool off by sleeping on rooftops or in parks, but even these open spaces offered little respite from the heat. By the beginning of July, public unrest had begun to grow. People, already pushed to their limits by the oppressive heat, were now frustrated by the lack of help. Riots broke out in several cities as citizens began to demand action from local governments. The social fabric of cities like New York began to unravel, with anger and anxiety taking hold. The heat wave not only made life physically unbearable, but also sowed seeds of social unrest that would have lasting consequences. Meanwhile, as the heat continued to choke the country, the effects on transportation and infrastructure became more apparent. In cities across the East Coast, streetcars came to a halt as the horses that powered them collapsed from heat exhaustion. This caused further chaos in the already overcrowded streets, with people struggling to find alternative means of getting around. In New York City, the situation grew so bad that public transportation had to be suspended altogether, leaving residents with no way to get from place to place. The heat had disrupted every part of life, making basic tasks like traveling to work or getting fresh water into a struggle. In the countryside, the agricultural community was hit just as hard. Farmers, who were already dealing with the effects of drought, now faced the added threat of crops failing due to the extreme heat. Fields that had once been full of lush crops began to dry up and wither under the intense rays of the sun. Some crops, like corn and wheat, were devastated by the heat, leaving farmers with little to harvest. Livestock, which relied on grazing, also suffered greatly. Many animals collapsed from the heat, unable to endure the scorching temperatures. The heat wave's effects reached beyond the cities, hitting rural communities hard and leaving the country's food supply at risk. The impact on the nation's economy was also substantial. With factories closed, agricultural yields low, and transportation ground to a halt in major cities, the country's economic activity came to a standstill. Many industries faced shutdowns due to the heat. while those that could continue to operate were forced to find new ways to adapt to the new reality. The loss of productivity and the increasing costs of trying to keep industries running put additional strain on both the economy and the people trying to get by. The extreme nature of the 1901 heatwave had far-reaching effects, not just on the immediate lives of those who lived through it, but on how the country began to think about extreme weather events. People realized just how unprepared they were for such an overwhelming disaster, and it prompted conversations about better disaster planning and infrastructure. But for those who lived through it, the lessons came too late to prevent the widespread suffering and loss of life that would follow. As the heat finally began to ease in August, the country was left to pick up the pieces, knowing that the summer of 1901 would never be forgotten. As the heat wave dragged into its third week, the relentless weather continued to overwhelm the eastern United States. By now, most of the country was experiencing sweltering heat, but it was the cities on the East Coast that felt the worst effects. In New York City, the heat had reached unimaginable levels, with temperatures remaining well above 95 degrees Fahrenheit even at night. This made it nearly impossible for people to find any relief as the stagnant, hot air clung to the streets, further intensifying the oppressive conditions. With no cooling breezes to offer respite and no air conditioning to help people cool down, the heat wave's toll was becoming unbearable. In addition to the sweltering temperatures, the humidity levels were so high that people found themselves struggling to breathe. Even in the early morning hours, the air was thick and heavy, and by midday it felt as if the entire city had turned into an oven. The heat was a constant companion that made even the simplest tasks feel like monumental challenges. Many people resorted to crowding into parks and public spaces in an attempt to escape the suffocating heat in their homes, but these spaces provided little relief as they too became sweltering hot during the day. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the most vulnerable people in society were suffering the most. The elderly and children were at a particular risk of heat-related illnesses, and many of them were unable to escape the heat. People who lived in cramped, poorly ventilated tenement buildings were especially hard hit. These buildings, often overcrowded with families living in small apartments, trapped heat inside, making it impossible for people to cool down. With little access to clean water or sanitation, the conditions in these neighborhoods became increasingly dire. As hospitals in cities like New York and Philadelphia became overwhelmed with heat stroke cases, many people turned to desperate measures to survive. The psychological toll of the heat wave was also becoming apparent. The combination of extreme heat and the inability to find relief created an atmosphere of anxiety and despair. Many people, unable to bear the strain of the relentless weather, began to crack under the pressure. It was reported that in some areas, a number of people who could no longer cope with the heat took their own lives, driven to despair by the unbearable conditions. The mental health crisis was yet another devastating consequence of the heat wave, as it impacted not just physical health, but also the well-being of individuals who struggled to cope with the constant suffocating heat. The public infrastructure was also feeling the strain of the heat wave. The city's streetcars, which were once a reliable form of transportation, were unable to function due to the collapse of horses from heat exhaustion. The heat was so intense that streetcars were forced to stop operating entirely in some areas, leaving people stranded. Even worse, the heat affected the country's already struggling railroad system, causing delays and disruptions in travel. The transportation issues only exacerbated the difficulty of getting basic necessities to people, leaving urban areas particularly vulnerable. In Philadelphia, the heat wave became a daily battle for survival. With several days in a row of temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the city's residents were feeling the heat more than ever. Schools and businesses were forced to close, and many people were left with no way of escaping the oppressive conditions. It wasn't just the heat that was a concern. The air was so thick with humidity that it made it feel even hotter than it actually was. The summer heat seemed to go on forever with no sign of relief in sight. At the same time, the effects of the drought that had been steadily developing in the Midwest and Ohio Valley were being felt more acutely. Farmers, already struggling with low rainfall, now had to contend with scorching temperatures that drained the last bit of moisture from their crops. Fields that had once been full of thriving crops were now barren and cracked, leaving many farmers facing near total crop failure. In Illinois, the state recorded its driest Kyrria calendar year ever, a sign of just how bad the drought had become. In Missouri, conditions were just as dire as the heat wave led to one of the driest years on record, with rainfall amounts lower than even in the notorious drought year of 1953. The rural communities across the country were not exempt from the heat's wrath, and farmers began to lose their livelihoods. For many, the failure of their crops meant that they would not have enough food or income to survive the year. The heat also impacted livestock, with many animals collapsing in the fields as they struggled to survive in the unbearable heat. In many areas, farmers were forced to sell off their animals as they could not provide the necessary care or food. The strain on rural communities was immense, and many families found themselves caught between the devastating drought and the unrelenting heat. Meanwhile, in cities, the heat wave continued to disrupt the lives of ordinary citizens. As people desperately searched for any way to cool down, many sought out shady areas or moved to the highest floors of buildings in the hope of catching a breeze. But even in the higher parts of the city, the heat was stifling. The inability to escape the heat left people with no option but to endure, and the psychological toll continued to mount. The heat wave was no longer just a meteorological event, it had become a living nightmare for those in its path. By the end of June, it was clear that this was not going to be a brief heat wave. The heat had become a constant companion for millions of people. With no signs of it letting up, the social and economic disruptions were becoming more apparent, as people struggled to go about their daily routines in a world that had been completely transformed by the heat. The cities were already beginning to feel the strain, and the countryside was quickly following suit. As the month came to a close, the nation could only watch helpless as the heat continued to take its toll, turning the summer of 1901 into one of the most deadly and destructive heat waves the country had ever experienced. As July began, the heat wave showed no signs of letting up, and the severity of the situation deepened across the United States. The already oppressive temperatures had become the new normal, and cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago continued to experience unbearable heat. In many of these places, the temperature hovered around 100 degrees Fahrenheit day after day, with no reprieve in sight. The heat was persistent, draining both physically and mentally, leaving many people at their breaking point. During the first week of July, conditions in New York City were particularly dire. By now, residents had grown accustomed to the intense heat, but it was far from tolerable. People were already struggling to keep cool, but with no effective relief, tempers began to flare. The heat had taken a toll on everyone, and the long days of relentless sun were beginning to feel like an unending punishment. With public transportation at a standstill due to the exhausted horses that powered the streetcars, getting from place to place became a challenge. Many businesses closed their doors, unable to function in such extreme conditions, while others remained open only because they had no choice. Despite the hardships, people tried to find ways to cope. Some took refuge in the city's parks or public squares, where they could at least catch some shade and breathe in what little cool air existed. But even the parks were not immune to the oppressive conditions. The heat had a strange way of warping everything it touched. Flowers wilted, trees drooped, and even the grass seemed to struggle under the heat's weight. The city's infrastructure, already overburdened by the demands of a growing population, began to fail under the stress of the heat. Water supplies became scarce, and many people began to ration their drinking water as temperatures remained in the high 90s and low 100s. In Philadelphia, conditions were no better. By July, the heat was so intense that the city's power supply struggled to keep up with demand. The strain on the electrical grid led to frequent blackouts, and in some cases, entire neighborhoods were plunged into darkness for hours at a time. The heat left many residents feeling trapped in their own homes, unable to cool off or find relief from the stifling air. The lack of air conditioning meant that most people had to rely on open windows and makeshift fans, but even that small comfort did little to lower the temperature. The psychological toll of being stuck in an oppressive heat wave was becoming more apparent. Residents were on edge and many were growing desperate for relief. As temperatures climbed, it became evident that the health impacts of the heat wave were becoming more severe. Hospitals across the affected areas were overwhelmed with cases of heat stroke, dehydration, and other heat-related illnesses. The elderly and young children were especially vulnerable, and many of them succumbed to the heat. Hospitals were flooded with patients, and it quickly became difficult for medical staff to keep up with the growing number of cases. In some areas, families were forced to deal with the aftermath of losing loved ones who had fallen victim to the heat. These deaths, though tragic, were not the end of the crisis. The heat continued to take its toll in other ways, disrupting daily life in ways that people were only beginning to understand. In rural areas, where agricultural workers and farmers relied on their crops for survival, the heat wave was devastating. The drought that had been creeping across the Midwest and Ohio Valley continued to worsen, and crops were drying up faster than they could be harvested. In Illinois, the crops were withering in the fields, and farmers found themselves facing the loss of everything they had worked for. In Missouri, which had already experienced one of the driest years on record, conditions only became more dire as the days wore on. Livestock began to die from dehydration and heat exhaustion, and farmers were left with nothing to sell. The heat, paired with the extreme drought, devastated the farming communities, and it would take years for many of them to recover. By now, the heat wave was no longer just a weather event. It had become a crisis that was touching every aspect of life in the eastern United States. The heat was relentless, and the societal impacts were far-reaching. Public health, infrastructure, and the economy were all struggling to keep up. And yet, there was no end in sight. The heat wave had become a new reality, and its effects were felt across the country. The temperature records were being shattered, and people were left to cope with an almost unbearable reality. As July dragged on, cities continued to experience near-constant heat, and relief was nowhere to be found. In some cities, the heat reached its peak in early July, with temperatures consistently topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the evenings. The impact on cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago continued to worsen, and rural areas already suffering from drought began to face even greater challenges. Yet, even as temperatures soared, the toll the heat wave took on people's mental and physical health continued to grow. It seemed that no part of the country was safe from its grip. By now, the massive death toll was starting to become apparent. The heat wave was officially responsible for thousands of deaths across the country, and estimates suggested that over 8,500 lives had been lost by the time the wave was over. But as difficult as this was to comprehend, the true toll was not just in the number of dead. The heat had disrupted entire communities, leaving families, businesses, and industries in ruins. It wasn't just a matter of temperature, it was a matter of survival, and as the summer continued, it became clear that the eastern United States was in the midst of a crisis unlike any it had faced before. As the heat continued, the long-lasting effects were becoming undeniable. People were left in limbo, trapped in a seemingly never-ending cycle of oppressive heat. The heat wave had shattered the lives of many, and the destruction it left behind would leave scars on the country for years to come. As August began, the relentless heat that had gripped the eastern United States for more than 2 months finally began to ease. By the 5th of August, temperatures in the Ohio Valley started to drop, marking the first break from the oppressive heat since late June. The relief, however, came too late for thousands of people who had already perished during the previous weeks. Despite the much-needed cooler temperatures, the aftermath of the heat wave would be felt for years to come. Across the country, the toll was apparent not just in the number of deaths, but in the long-lasting social and economic impacts. In cities, people who had endured the heat were now faced with the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. The death toll had surpassed 8,500 people, and countless others were left with the emotional and physical scars of the event. The heat had exposed many of the vulnerabilities within the country's infrastructure, particularly in densely populated urban areas. Power grids had failed, water supplies were scarce, and transportation systems had collapsed, leaving a clear need for major reform and better preparation for future disasters. Agriculture had been among the hardest hit sectors. With crops withered and fields scorched by the unrelenting heat, many farmers were left with little to nothing. The drought that had accompanied the heat wave devastated rural communities across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, where families who had relied on farming for their livelihoods faced financial ruin. The effects of this disaster stretched far beyond the summer of 1901, as farmers struggled to recover from the loss of crops and livestock. It took years for many of these communities to rebuild, and some never fully recovered. In the aftermath of the heat wave, the country was left grappling with the realization that extreme weather events like this were not as rare as people had once believed. The disaster of 1901 served as a grim reminder of the vulnerability of human societies to the forces of nature. It prompted some to advocate for better preparation and response to future climate events, though the full-scale implementation of these ideas would not come until later. The heat wave would remain in the collective memory of the country, a warning about the dangers of extreme weather that would not be ignored. As the years passed, the heat wave of 1901 slowly faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and other historic events. But for those who had lived through it, The memory of that summer would never fully disappear. The suffering endured by so many left a lasting mark, and it was clear that society had learned the hard way just how much a climate disaster could alter the course of everyday life. While the temperature records from the heatwave have long since been surpassed, the lessons learned from the summer of 1901 remain just as relevant today. As we face increasingly erratic weather patterns in the modern world, it is important to remember the power of nature and the importance of preparing for the unexpected. The heatwave serves as a stark reminder that no matter how advanced we become, we are still at the mercy of the natural world. So, while the temperature records may have been broken in later years, the summer of 1901 will always hold a special place in history. The stories of those who lived through it remind us of the strength and resilience of the human spirit in the face of a disaster that seemed unstoppable. It is a chapter in American history that, despite being largely forgotten by many, still holds lessons for us all. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive into the devastating heat wave of 1901. If you're interested in learning more about other historical weather events, be sure to subscribe and check out our other videos on extreme weather disasters. What do you think about the 1901 heat wave? Let us know in the comments and share your thoughts on how we can better prepare for such extreme weather in the future. The summer of 2003 marked an unprecedented natural disaster across Europe. The heat wave that would go down in history as one of the most severe and deadly heat events the continent had ever experienced. Temperatures soared to extreme levels, reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius in many areas, and in some places the heat persisted for days on end. The heat wave was particularly harsh in countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, where the high temperatures were not only record-breaking, but also relentlessly persistent. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary summer heat, this was a crisis, one that would claim more than 70,000 lives across Europe. In France, the impact of the heat wave was especially severe. The country's typical mild summers were no match for the scorching temperatures that engulfed the nation. Cities like Paris, known for their pleasant summer weather, found themselves under a relentless heat dome, with temperatures rising well above 40 degrees Celsius for multiple days in a row. In fact, the highest temperature ever recorded in France at the time, 44.1 degrees Celsius, was a shocking reminder of just how extreme the heat had become. This sudden and extreme shift in weather took many people by surprise. Unlike other parts of the world, France was not equipped to handle such intense heat, especially in residential areas where central air conditioning was rare. The heat wave in France did more than just make the air unbearably hot. It brought health risks that many were unprepared for. Dehydration, heat stroke, and heat-related illnesses surged, particularly among the elderly and young children. With hospitals quickly overwhelmed, it became clear that the French health system was not prepared for an event of this magnitude. The death toll from this heat wave in France alone reached over 14,000, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's history. But France was not the only country feeling the heat. Across southern Europe, the effects were widespread and devastating. In Spain and Portugal, the heat wave led to similarly catastrophic outcomes. Temperatures soared to near 50 degrees Celsius in parts of Spain, and the combination of intense heat and drought created the perfect conditions for wildfires. These fires ravaged forests, destroyed homes, and took lives. In Portugal, nearly 2,000 people died due to the heat, with rural areas bearing the brunt of the damage. The situation was worsened by freak storms that swept through the southern regions, further increasing the danger and disrupting already fragile infrastructures. Even the typically cooler northern parts of Spain were not spared, as temperatures soared to levels never before seen, breaking decades-old records. The heat wave was not just a weather event, it was a major public health emergency that exposed the lack of preparedness across many countries in Europe. Most of these nations had not considered such extreme heat to be a serious threat, as their climates were not typically prone to such high temperatures. For instance, in the United Kingdom, temperatures reached an all-time high of 38.5 degrees Celsius. While this may not sound as extreme compared to other countries, it was the highest temperature ever recorded in the UK at the time. The heat put immense pressure on healthcare systems, utilities, and governments, all of which scrambled to cope with the health crisis and infrastructural challenges posed by the relentless heat. As this intense period of heat continued into August, it became clear that the impact was far-reaching. The severe temperatures were exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, particularly in large cities like Paris. The heat island effect occurs when cities, with their buildings, roads, and limited greenery, trap and retain heat, making them even hotter than surrounding rural areas. This made it difficult for residents to escape the oppressive heat, particularly at night when temperatures remained high, providing little relief. The European heat wave of 2003 not only tested the resilience of communities, but also highlighted the need for urgent changes in how countries handle extreme weather events. The health consequences were just the beginning. What was happening across Europe was a preview of the kind of climate challenges that the future might hold if action wasn't taken to prepare and adapt. But at the time, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the effects would be. As Europe baked under the scorching sun, the true magnitude of the disaster began to unfold, setting the stage for the even more devastating days to come. As the heat wave stretched into August, it became clear that the conditions were far from ordinary. The combination of high-pressure systems and persistent southerly winds from the Sahara Desert resulted in a relentless wave of heat across Europe. This heat was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. The conditions were so extreme that many regions were breaking temperature records that had stood for decades. In France, for example, the temperature reached an astonishing 44.1 degrees Celsius, which was the highest temperature ever recorded in the country. This extreme heat became a serious health risk for many, especially the elderly, young children, and those with pre-existing health conditions. For countries like France, where the summers were typically mild, this sudden surge in temperatures caused a major public health crisis. In many areas, people simply weren't prepared for this kind of heat. Air conditioning was not common in most homes, particularly in the northern regions of France, where summers were rarely this hot. As a result, many people had no way to cool down, making them vulnerable to heat-related illnesses like heat stroke and dehydration. The situation was worsened by the urban heat island effect, where cities with their dense concrete and asphalt absorbed and retained heat more than rural areas, making the temperatures in cities even hotter. The heat wave in France led to over 14,000 heat-related deaths, with most of the victims being elderly people who were unable to cope with the extreme heat. The situation was dire, and as temperatures climbed higher, hospitals and emergency services found themselves overwhelmed with people suffering from heat-related illnesses. This strain on the health system delayed treatments, which only added to the death toll. In some places, the government took action, setting up helplines for concerned citizens and providing information on how to stay cool and hydrated, but by then the damage had already been done. In Portugal, the heat wave was equally catastrophic. A combination of high temperatures and dry conditions led to widespread wildfires, with the intense heat fanning the flames and making them harder to control. The record-breaking temperatures, with nighttime lows still above 30 degrees Celsius, caused further stress on both people and infrastructure. In addition to the human toll, the agricultural sector also took a massive hit. The drought created crop shortages affecting food production across the region. The damage to agriculture led to long-term economic consequences, and as the heat wave raged on, the consequences of the extreme weather became painfully clear. Across Europe, the heat wave was leaving its mark not just in the form of heat-related deaths, but also in terms of the damage to infrastructure. Many countries experienced power outages as the demand for electricity soared, with air conditioning units working overtime to try and keep buildings cool. The strain on power grids was intense, and the infrastructure in many areas was simply not built to handle this level of demand. The agricultural sector was not the only one affected. Water shortages also became an issue as rivers and lakes, which were crucial sources of water for both drinking and irrigation, began to dry up. These extreme conditions, however, were not limited to just one or two countries. The heat wave spread across much of Europe, with countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany also experiencing devastating heat and drought. The Netherlands, for instance, recorded temperatures as high as 37.8 degrees Celsius. This was close to the national record, which had stood for more than a century. This unusual heat was felt in both urban and rural areas, and just like in other affected countries, the elderly were particularly vulnerable. While the heat wave did not break records in every country, the intensity and length of the event were unprecedented in most places. In Germany, the heat caused severe disruptions in shipping on the Elbe and Danube rivers. Low water levels, a result of the ongoing drought, made it difficult for ships to navigate. This not only impacted transportation, but also affected the economy, as fewer goods could be moved via these critical waterways. Similarly, power plants in countries like Germany had to reduce their output due to the high water temperatures in rivers, which made it unsafe to cool their reactors. With the combination of heat and drought affecting so many sectors, the broader economic impact was becoming undeniable. As the temperatures stayed high and the situation worsened, it was becoming clearer that the aftermath of the heatwave would be felt long after the weather returned to normal. The 2003 heatwave was not just a summer event, it marked a turning point in how Europe would approach extreme weather. It revealed how vulnerable many countries were to such events and exposed the gaps in public health systems, emergency preparedness, and infrastructure. The intense heat, the health risks, and the economic toll made it clear that something needed to be done to prevent or mitigate future disasters. As the heatwave continued to ravage Europe, it became apparent that the extreme weather was having a profound effect on the environment. Forests, fields, and farmlands, which were already under strain from the lack of rainfall, were now facing the additional burden of record-high temperatures. The drought was especially devastating for crops, and the effects were felt across much of the agricultural sector. In countries like Spain and Italy, where agriculture is a key part of the economy, the consequences were immediate. Fields of wheat, corn, and olives dried up, and many farmers faced the tragic reality of losing their harvests. The economic toll was significant, with billions of euros in damages across Europe's agricultural industry. The heatwave also led to an increased risk of wildfires. With the combination of dry vegetation and high winds, the stage was set for catastrophic fires to break out. In Portugal, the situation became dire as fires spread rapidly across the country. Fueled by the dry conditions and intense heat, the fires threatened both rural and urban areas, and thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes to avoid being trapped by the flames. The firefighting efforts were complicated by the extreme heat, making it harder to control the fires and protect homes and infrastructure. Portugal was not alone in facing these dangers. In Spain, Italy, and France, wildfires broke out as well, leading to further evacuations and destruction of property. The fires not only claimed lives, but also caused significant damage to the natural environment, with vast areas of forest and wildlife habitats being destroyed. Wildlife was another group that suffered severely during the heatwave. The drought reduced the availability of food and water for many species, forcing animals to seek out new areas for survival. In some regions, animals were found wandering in urban areas searching for water. The heat also put stress on aquatic life, with rivers, lakes, and streams drying up or reaching dangerously low levels. Fish and other aquatic species were at risk due to the increase in water temperature, which led to oxygen depletion in some bodies of water. The delicate balance of ecosystems across Europe was disturbed, and many experts warned that the long-term effects on biodiversity could be severe if such heat waves became more frequent. The situation was further complicated by the human response to the heat. As temperatures soared, many people took to rivers and lakes in an attempt to cool down, only to find that these bodies of water were already dangerously low. The lack of water made it harder for people to stay hydrated, which only contributed to the rise in heat-related illnesses. Hospitals continued to be overwhelmed, and while many governments provided resources to assist the public, the scale of the crisis made it difficult to address every need. Additionally, the heatwave had significant long-term consequences for Europe's infrastructure. As the ground dried out, the earth beneath roads and buildings shifted, causing cracks and structural damage. Railway tracks were especially vulnerable, with some sections buckling under the extreme heat, disrupting travel. The heat caused concrete to crack and asphalt to soften, leading to delays and safety concerns on the roads. Airports in many regions experienced delays as ground crews struggled to deal with the heat, and air travel became less reliable. The cost of repairing the damage to infrastructure was enormous, and many European countries found themselves facing bills that stretched into the billions. The economic losses did not end with agriculture and infrastructure. The heat wave caused significant problems for the tourism industry as well. In countries like France and Italy, where tourism is a major part of the economy, travelers stayed away due to the unbearable heat. Resort areas and historical sites saw fewer visitors, and many outdoor events were canceled due to the risk of heat-related health problems. On the flip side, there was a rise in demand for air conditioning and cooling systems, leading to a spike in sales, but this only added to the strain on power grids. Perhaps one of the most sobering outcomes of the 2003 heat wave was the realization that climate change could be a driving force behind such extreme events. Scientists and climate experts began to warn that as global temperatures continued to rise, Europe could expect more frequent and severe heat waves in the coming decades. This prompted governments across the continent to take a closer look at their climate policies and disaster preparedness plans. While the heat wave eventually subsided, the lessons learned from this disaster were far from forgotten. European governments began to implement measures aimed at mitigating the impacts of extreme weather, including heat action plans, better urban planning to prevent the urban heat island effect, and investments in green technologies. The aftermath of the 2003 heat wave highlighted the vulnerability of Europe to extreme weather events and underscored the importance of both local and global efforts to combat climate change. The severity of the heat, its economic consequences, and the toll it took on human and animal life left a lasting impact. It was no longer a question of whether such events would happen again, but rather, when. The heat wave in its wake set the stage for greater awareness of climate risks and the urgent need for adaptation strategies to protect both people and the planet from the intensifying impacts of climate change. As the years passed after the intense heat wave of 2003, Europe began to adapt to the rising threat of extreme weather. The lessons learned from that summer would inform a series of responses aimed at minimizing the impacts of future climate events. One of the most significant changes was in the way cities approached urban planning and environmental sustainability. In the wake of the heat wave, many European cities began to incorporate more green spaces into their urban landscapes. By creating parks, rooftop gardens, and increasing tree cover, cities hope to reduce the urban heat island effect, which causes cities to be much warmer than surrounding rural areas due to the dense concentration of buildings and human activity. Many governments also took steps to improve early warning systems for extreme weather. Heat waves, which had previously been seen as occasional anomalies, were now recognized as potentially life-threatening events. Across Europe, national meteorological services worked to enhance their forecasting abilities, while health departments developed heat action plans to protect vulnerable populations. In some countries, special measures were introduced to ensure that elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions had access to cooling centers and could avoid the dangerous heat. Hospitals also ramped up preparedness to manage heat-related illnesses, including heat stroke and dehydration. In addition to heat-related precautions, there was a growing emphasis on reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. Following the extreme heat of 2003, the European Union and its member states intensified their efforts to meet climate goals, aiming to limit global warming. Renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power began to receive more attention and investment, with the EU setting ambitious targets for reducing carbon footprints. The development of energy-efficient technologies and the promotion of public transportation helped decrease reliance on fossil fuels, which contributed to both global warming and the frequency of extreme weather events. Farmers, too, took action in response to the harsh conditions that had devastated crops during the heat wave. In countries where agriculture was a key industry, new farming techniques were introduced to help adapt to changing climate conditions. Drought-resistant crops were developed and tested, and irrigation systems were upgraded to conserve water. Additionally, many farmers invested in technologies to monitor weather patterns and soil moisture levels, which helped them make more informed decisions about planting and harvesting. These measures aim to increase resilience and ensure that European agriculture could survive and thrive, even in the face of increasing climate uncertainty. Despite these efforts, the memory of the heat wave remained vivid, and many were still grappling with the lingering effects. Water shortages were a continuous concern, and many regions began to explore new methods for water conservation and management. The drought conditions, which had plagued large parts of Europe in 2003, had become an ongoing challenge. Countries began to invest in desalination plants and other water-saving technologies to ensure that they could meet the growing demands of both their populations and their agricultural sectors. As the climate continued to change, the conversation around heat waves and extreme weather shifted from being about recovery to being about preparation. No longer were such events seen as rare occurrences, but rather as inevitable risks that needed to be planned for. Governments focused not just on reducing the immediate damage caused by heat waves, but on developing long-term strategies for climate adaptation. This included improving the resilience of infrastructure, investing in renewable energy, and enhancing public health systems to deal with the ongoing threats posed by extreme weather. While the heat wave of 2003 had been an unprecedented event, it was no longer an isolated incident. In the years that followed, other European countries experienced similarly devastating heat waves, leading to the realization that climate change was not just a future threat, it was already here. The lesson of the heat wave was clear: extreme weather events, fueled by rising global temperatures, would only become more frequent and intense, and it was up to governments, businesses, and individuals to prepare for the inevitable. In conclusion, the heat wave of 2003 served as a wake-up call for Europe. It forced the continent to confront the reality of climate change and the profound impact that extreme weather can have on human life, ecosystems, and economies. The widespread devastation it caused in terms of loss of life, crop failure, wildfires, and infrastructure damage was a turning point in how Europe understood its vulnerability to climate change. The steps taken in the aftermath of the heat wave, from changes in urban planning to the promotion of renewable energy, set the foundation for a more resilient Europe. While the long-term consequences of climate change remain uncertain, the lessons from that summer continue to guide efforts to protect the planet and its people from the increasing threat of extreme weather. The summer of 2010 was a strange and deadly one for many parts of the world, but nowhere felt the heat more painfully than Russia. What started out as an unusually warm spring quickly spiraled into one of the most intense and deadly heat waves ever recorded in modern times. By the time it ended, more than 55,000 people had lost their lives. Over 9 million hectares of farmland were scorched, and parts of the country were burning in record-breaking wildfires. But this disaster wasn't just bad luck, it was the result of a series of events that had been building up for months. It all began with a global weather pattern shift known as El Niño. From June of 2009 to May of 2010, a moderate El Niño warmed up the ocean currents and started changing weather all across the northern hemisphere. That's what kicked off the first wave of unusual heat in places like the United States, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, North Africa, and large parts of Europe and Russia. But that was only the beginning. Right after that, another global weather event took over. This time it was La Niña, and it was much stronger. Starting in June of 2010 and lasting through the next summer, this La Niña event was one of the strongest ever recorded, and it hit hard. Powerful anticyclones, basically large high-pressure systems, started building up across the northern hemisphere. In Russia, one of the biggest anticyclones parked itself right over Siberia. It didn't move for months. That created a kind of atmospheric traffic jam. The hot air just sat there, baking everything underneath it. By June, the temperatures were already rising fast. Across the eastern United States, the Middle East, northeastern China, and especially in European Russia, the heat became unbearable. Global weather stations reported that June was the fourth warmest month ever recorded. In the northern hemisphere, April to June was the warmest stretch ever documented on land, more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit above average. But it wasn't just the temperature that made things bad, it was how long it lasted. Normally heat waves come and go, but this one just stayed day after day, week after week. It didn't rain. The wind didn't blow. The air didn't move. By the end of June, the soil was already drying out. Farmers started noticing their crops were wilting, and then the fires started. The heat wave officially kicked off in Moscow on June 27th. The temperature hit 91 degrees Fahrenheit, way above what anyone was used to there, and it stayed high for days. Throughout the rest of that week, the thermometer didn't drop below 90. Other parts of the country started heating up too. In Yakutia, deep in Siberia, the temperature hit over 95 degrees, which was extremely rare. The roads were so hot, city workers in Moscow had to spray them down with water, just to stop the pavement from melting. By the end of June, over 1,200 people had already drowned in Russia. Many of them were just trying to cool off in lakes, rivers, or canals, but the heat made people careless. Emergency officials said that many of the drowning victims had been drinking or swimming in unsafe spots. Still, nobody thought things would get as bad as they did. At that point, it was just hot. Dangerously hot, but it wasn't yet a full-blown disaster. That would come soon. As the heat wave tightened its grip across Russia in the summer of that year, records began to fall one after another. Cities that usually saw mild, comfortable summers were suddenly dealing with temperatures well above normal. In Moscow, the thermometer climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, an extreme number for a place that typically stays far cooler during that season. Across central and western Russia, asphalt buckled, rivers dropped to alarmingly low levels, and power grids came under intense strain. The intense demand for air conditioning and cooling systems pushed energy use to all-time highs. In many areas, the electrical infrastructure simply couldn't handle it. Blackouts rolled through towns and cities, leaving thousands without power during the hottest days of the year. In rural areas, the situation was even worse. Many small villages lacked modern cooling systems altogether. Elderly residents and young children were the most vulnerable. With no relief from the brutal heat, the number of heat-related deaths began to climb rapidly. Hospitals struggled to manage the growing number of patients suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and related complications. Even at night, temperatures refused to drop, giving people no break from the intense heat. Sleeping became difficult, tempers flared. The emotional and physical stress took a toll on the population. For many, it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling that something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just an unusually hot summer, it was a crisis unfolding in real time. As the heat wave continued into the heart of summer, Russia began to face a growing national crisis. Temperatures stayed dangerously high for weeks. Crops withered in the fields, hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland dried up, leading to widespread crop failure. Wheat, one of Russia's main exports, was hit especially hard. The government was forced to ban grain exports by early August of that year to protect its own food supply. That decision had ripple effects far beyond Russia's borders. Countries that depended on Russian wheat suddenly faced shortages, and global food prices began to rise. Within Russia, food prices also spiked, adding more pressure to families already struggling with the heat. In some parts of the country, shelves in local markets emptied quickly and panic buying set in. Fires burned through forests and peat bogs around Moscow and other central regions, releasing thick clouds of smoke. These fires weren't just destructive, they made the already unbearable air even more dangerous. The smoke settled over the capital, making it hard to breathe. Visibility dropped, people were told to stay inside. Hospitals filled up with patients suffering from heat stroke, breathing problems, and other heat-related illnesses. By this point, the situation had overwhelmed local authorities. Emergency services were stretched thin, entire towns were surrounded by flames. Volunteers and even local villagers worked alongside firefighters too. As the Russian heat wave dragged on, the environmental impact grew more severe. Forests, grasslands, and farmlands suffered from extreme drought. In many regions, crops failed entirely. Wheat fields that once stretched green across the landscape turned to dry, cracked dust. Russia, one of the world's largest grain exporters at the time, was forced to ban exports completely due to the poor harvest. This led to price spikes in global food markets, with ripple effects felt far beyond the country's borders. Air quality became a major concern. Thick smoke from widespread wildfires filled the skies, especially around major cities. The combination of extreme heat, stagnant air, and smoke created a choking haze. In some areas, visibility dropped to just a few hundred feet. Breathing became difficult, especially for those with asthma or other health conditions. The environmental damage didn't end with fire and drought. Wildlife also faced harsh conditions. Rivers and lakes dried up or became too warm to sustain fish populations. Insects and animals that usually thrived in cooler conditions struggled to survive. Entire ecosystems shifted in response to the intense and sudden heat, leaving scientists concerned about long-term effects. The Russian heat wave became a wake-up call for many around the world. Scientists and climate experts pointed to the event as a clear example of how global temperatures were changing. While no single weather event could be blamed entirely on climate change, the severity and duration of this heat wave fit into a growing pattern. For Russia, and for the rest of the world, it marked a moment where extreme weather could no longer be ignored.